Thanks for joining me today. So, what shall we talk about today? Well, I got a few comments about the last episode that spurred me to... That's kind of a violent image. I'm trying to be more accurate with my words these days. Inspired me, moved me, too vague. Gave me the idea, not exactly causal. Maybe I shouldn't be trying to be more accurate. Some days it's easier than others to deal with the inadequacies of language, the inaccuracies of language. Every word's not quite right, you know? And yet sometimes you just got to keep going anyway. But for me, the way I'm built, it's when I don't choose the right word, it's like there's a little wince inside me. So in my own self-interest, I try to do the best that I can. Because that's excellence is always self-interested, right? Whether you realize it or not. Anyway, so I thought what I talked about last time could use some additional explication and a zooming in. So did some more writing on that, and I'm going to go through it. And I realized that, and you can tell me what you think, but this format of, because I'm doing a lot of writing these days, this format of reading something that I wrote and riffing off of it is really good for me. I hope it's okay with you. If it's not, I'm open to hearing that. But it's like it gives me the illusion that I'm actually talking to someone else. It gives me something to relate to. And sometimes that's just easier to get me started. Because it's like, I can read it and be like, what does this person mean? What are they really saying? Even though it's me. But it creates the illusion of an other that I can key off of. And as a Libra rising, there's some healthiness to that. So the first thing I want to say before I dive into that is there was at least one or two stories I heard where the last episode, which I called something like What Stabilizes You, was talking about the structure of what people actually use to stabilize. To recap a bit, we talked about that people orient toward truth because they know they're supposed to, or they say they orient toward truth, and they want to look like they orient toward truth, and they do their best. But just because you'd like to think that about yourself doesn't make it true. And I don't think I said this last time quite directly, but I'll say it this way. If you think you're someone who's really oriented toward truth, look at your chart. Look at what it says, because it may know something about you that you don't. And that's one of the really cool things about, in particular, Vedic astrology, because I think it gets more structural in more accurate ways than Western astrology. So if you haven't looked at a Lahiri Ayanamsha Vedic astrology chart, of the Lahiri Ayanamsha is I think the most accurate from what I can tell, and certainly the most widely used Vedic model. It certainly taught me a lot of things about myself that I didn't know, like stuff related to the Libra rising, which the first time my astrologer said that I was a Libra rising, I was like, what? Because I, like many people do, collapsed it into what people think about Libra suns, in that descriptive astrology way. But that subtle existential interface, the ascendant is your sort of algorithm of interface with life, the way I'm defining it. It's not about your personality. It expresses in your personality, but because your rising sign has to do with how you, like I said, existentially interface. It's like your first orientation with life. It doesn't necessarily show up in expression. It can show up in a structural, very hidden, nearly invisible way. Like just as an example, Adolf Hitler is a Libra rising. Now, people argue about his chart, but I've looked at a few different versions. And from a developmental astrology perspective, I would definitely defend that he's a Libra rising. If you look at the whole chart, it just makes a lot more sense. But to think of Adolf Hitler, this infamous character, forceful, committed, determined, more than a little bit crazy, but power, not used largely for good, but no doubt that he's powerful. And you think of him as independent and outspoken, and he's a Libra rising. He's fueling off of what he's getting in response from people, and hated being alone. So he also, I think it's Mars and Rahu in 10th. I'm quite sure it's Rahu in 10th. So he has a lot of authority push energy, a lot of yang in him. But on a deeper level, there was this, am I okay? Am I worthy? Are we good? Kind of thing going on. He's existentially relational in that way. And so, however independent and powerful in expression he appeared, upstream of that was a keying off of other people. And, probably he could never get enough of it, which was one of the things that maybe made him mad. It was driven by, on some level, a desire to connect. So this is just a little bit of an aside. The importance of knowing your ascendant in Vedic astrology, and what that says about your existential structural mechanisms. You may be surprised by it because it doesn't necessarily show up in expression. I'd say, from what I can tell so far, it's like 50-50, maybe a little more, 60-40. It doesn't necessarily show up in expression. It can, but when it doesn't, all the more reason to know it, because it can reveal a whole set of invisible dynamics that are operating. Okay, I didn't think I'd be talking about that at all. So let's get to what I did want to talk about. Okay, so this, like I said, follows what I read last time. And one more thing before I forget, I'm going to come back around to that, but in case I put anyone to sleep while reading this, I wanted to remind people, I think I mentioned this at least once before, this will probably be my last mention of it. I am doing a course, possibly, maybe, honestly, it depends on how many people sign up. I may not do it at all, but the course is called Discernment, Structure, and Leadership, From Clear Thinking to Responsible Authority. And that course is going to be 11 weeks in a row on Zoom, 11:30 a.m. Pacific, beginning Thursday, April 2nd. And, I'll put the link to the course in the show notes. You can take a look at the description of it. But honestly, I've written the description in a vague enough way that we can do whatever we want based on who's there and what they bring. But the main thing I do want to tell you is that I want to try to teach structural thinking. In the last course I did about critical thinking, which I was afraid to try for a really long time, to teach critical thinking, I didn't know if I could do that. And it was a challenge for me. And I think it went quite well. And this now has given me the confidence to try to teach structural thinking. And it's important because it's even more rare than good critical thinking. And it's different to be able to follow. There's a difference between being able to follow structural thinking, which is a skill in and of itself, But to be able to generate structural thinking yourself, that's a different thing. And I'd say that's 1 in 1,000 people can do that. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to use what people bring, problems, situations, challenges, whatever they have, and look at the underlying structures that are causing that those challenges to be. Okay, so and what I read right now is going to relate to structural thinking. That's why I wanted to talk about this. Okay, so the preceding discussion established a central premise that the moon, as a primary regulatory function, describes how an individual stabilizes under pressure. This framing shifts attention away from stated values and toward observable behavior. It is not sufficient to ask what a person believes to be true or important. The more precise question is what they use in real time to regain equilibrium when destabilized. And that equilibrium can be relational, energetic, emotional, structural, financial, whatever that equilibrium is. There's a lot of different kinds of destabilization. This distinction introduces a deeper and more operational inquiry. If individuals do not in practice stabilize around truth, then what do they stabilize around? The answer is neither singular nor arbitrary. Across individuals and contexts, a limited set of stabilizing patterns appear with consistency. These patterns are not abstract philosophical positions, they are functional priorities that determine how a person responds when accuracy, comfort, identity, or relationship come into conflict. And that phrase there, functional priorities, when you hear that, you want to hear structure. It's a structure. It may be invisible, it may be difficult to grasp, but it has a structure to it. And when you learn to think is really kind of, we could say process reality structurally. I don't know if I've settled on the phraseology yet, but for now it's thinking structurally. When you learn to see that, as I'll get to in this, you can start to see a whole lot and predict a whole lot about people. An amazing martial arts teacher I trained with a long time ago, Peter Ralston, wrote in one of his books, see if I can get it right. It's like it said, if you can see the path they're on, then you will know which way they'll turn. And he was amazing at being able to read the kind of energetic context that a person was operating in. So when you were playing with them, it looked like he was reading your mind, but he wasn't reading your mind. He was reading the energetic structural frame that you were physically operating in. And it's not difficult if you're sensitive and put enough time into it, that I don't know if this is real or intuitive or not, but I did do enough martial arts to get to experience this. It's like when someone decides to make a movement, it's like there's a flash. For me, it was sometimes visual, but like you can see it. I don't know whether you're picking up the energy of the neurons firing or what, but I got good enough at it that I could be functional with it. And Peter was just a master. It just was like reading billboards for him, it seemed. He knew exactly what you were going to do, or so it seemed, whenever he wanted to. And that's a kind of structural thinking. It's seeing the context that someone is inside of. And then you can see all sorts of things. If you want to hurt them, like in martial arts, you can do that. If you want to help them, you can do that too. It's often harder as that kind of thing goes. But, it's all the same thing. It's just being able to see the structural pattern that the content is operating inside of. And that's something that can be learned, and it's really, really powerful. Okay, so now we go into the different stabilizing orientations. One common stabilizing orientation is emotional. In this configuration, the primary criterion is affective regulation. A statement or interpretation is accepted insofar as it reduces distress or restores a sense of internal ease, i.e., what's comfortable. Conversely, information that is accurate but emotionally destabilizing is resisted, reframed, or ignored. The governing function is not truth discrimination, but emotional containment. From the outside, this can appear as inconsistency or avoidance. Structurally, it is coherent relative to the subject, to the person. Structurally, it is coherent. The system is organized to preserve emotional equilibrium above all else. It's just a value priority. So from their perspective, and objectively speaking, you could say it is coherent. They're doing what the system is designed to do. That's part of structural thinking, in case I don't get to this. Structural thinking is seeing how the expression is an inevitable outcome of the structure. It's like the shape the rat runs through the maze is a result of the structure of the maze. Maybe the maze has options in it, depending on how the maze is created, but the maze structures where the rat will run. So the more structured the maze, or the more tightly the rat holds to the maze, the more predictable it is. And it's coherent. Here's the shape of the maze, and then the rat runs through it. That's how structure works. Okay. A second stabilizing orientation centers on identity. Here, the determining question is whether new information can be integrated without requiring a reorganization of self-concept. This is different than emotion. When truth threatens identity, it is not evaluated on its merits alone, but on its compatibility with the existing structure of self. If integration would necessitate a loss or transformation of identity, resistance follows. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a prioritization of continuity, of sameness. The individual stabilizes by maintaining a consistent sense of who they are, even at the cost of accuracy. And this can be gross or it can be very subtle. But if you know how to look, you can spot it. A third pattern is relational stabilization. In this case, the preservation of connection, belonging, or loyalty takes precedence. It is often subordinated. Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. Let me start over. A third pattern is relational stabilization. In this case, the preservation of connection, belonging, or loyalty takes precedence. When truth introduces the possibility of relational disruption, it is often subordinated. Individuals organized in this way will distort, soften, or withhold accurate perception in order to maintain the bond. This pattern is particularly visible in tightly coupled systems such as families, organizations, and ideological communities, where the cost of disalignment is experienced as relational threat. Let me say that last part again. This pattern is particularly visible in tightly coupled systems such as families, organizations, like businesses. I've worked with a lot of businesses and seen this, and ideological communities, where the cost of disalignment is experienced as relational threat. That's a kind of category error. When critique or new information, it's not a threat to the relationship, but it's experienced as such. Therefore, harmony becomes more important than truth, and the truth is discarded. Again, the behavior is structurally coherent. The system is stabilizing around connection. It's the shape of the maze says that harmony, connection, relationality is more important than truth. it's a hierarchy. Now, the person won't necessarily, or the organization won't necessarily say that. Usually they won't, but you go by the behavior. That's where you see the structure. The pattern of behavior is the structure. A fourth pattern may be described as shallow coherence. Individuals in this configuration seek explanations that provide a sense of understanding without requiring full structural accuracy. Let me say that again. Individuals with this configuration seek explanations that provide a sense of understanding, not true understanding, without requiring full structural accuracy. The result is a preference for narratives that are internally consistent at a superficial level, but do not withstand deeper examination. You hear this a lot with people who are loyal to a political figure. I mean, it's really easy to see with Trump, but I don't want to pick only on Republicans or Trumpers. You can hear the same thing with Democrats. If you criticize, this is why I didn't really think of it. This is why this is why political parties create talking points, and the Republicans are way better at this than the Democrats are. You can see sometimes people like Jon Stewart will show montages of, what they call surrogates, people who are like representatives of the party, or people who are promoters of the party. And people will create these montages where they'll show, like 12 different people on 12 different radio shows, TV shows, podcasts, etc., and play in rapid succession the talking points, and it's a natural sounding conversation, and then boom, then they drop into the talking points, and it's not hard to show that this stuff has been written, focus grouped, tested, and released and memorized, because they're parroting those talking points. And that's propaganda. That's like how it works. It's marketing and psychology and manipulation, but it works really well for people, back to the text here, for people who prefer shallow coherence. And you've probably had the experience of trying to have at least semi-sophisticated, intelligent conversation with someone about politics or something, and then they say the talking point, usually not as well as the person they saw on TV say it, right? Because they only heard it, 2 or 3 or 4 times, maybe they didn't study it. And then you hear it and you're like, oh, wow, I know where they got that from. They haven't really thought it through. They're just saying what they heard. I had this debate a while back with one of my members who was an attorney, smart guy. And I was using Trump's tariffs as an example of poor critical thinking, I think, and came at it a few different ways, and what economists say. And the last time in the late 1920s, what happened when we used tariffs like this, and I made a case about it and how it wasn't critical thinking, and he said, like, well, we need to give it time. And it was like, this was an attorney, like, he knows somewhere in him that's not a good argument. But that's what the Republicans were saying when they were getting pushback about, the tariffs went into effect, I think it was April 2025, and prices went up and the stock market tanked for a month or so, and people reacted. And that was one of the main things, like, well, we need to give it time. And it's like, okay, well, what's the plan? How is manufacturing going to come back? Because economists are saying if the iPhone is produced in the United States, they're going to cost $6,000 instead of $600 or whatever. What's your argument to that? Well, we need to give it time. It's just a parroting talking point. It's not a deep structural or critical thinking argument. But that works. Why? So why does that work even with intelligent people? It works because of this fourth pattern called shallow coherence. They're not looking for a deep structural accuracy. They don't need a picture that makes sense of reality. They're looking for a narrative that is superficially comfortable, but won't withstand deeper examination. They just don't need that. I'll go back to my writing here. And this is not necessarily due to a lack of cognitive capacity. Like I said, with that lawyer, I was shocked. Rather, deeper analysis introduces destabilization that the system is not organized to tolerate. In other words, it's uncomfortable. The individual stabilizes at the point where understanding feels sufficient, even if it is structurally incomplete. And this is why, politics is mostly marketing and psychology and very little actual leadership, because real leadership has to include telling people things that they don't want to hear and have a difficult time taking in. Otherwise, and this is what's so confusing, speaking of structure, I thought about using democracy as an example to talk about structure, and I don't know. I don't think I will today, maybe another time. But democracy is such an interesting example because people right now, because of Trump and what he's doing, they see the Democrats, one of their party lines, one of their talking points is there's a threat to democracy. I don't see that at all. This is the result of democracy. And so someone who sees what's happening, what Trump is doing, but the executive branch has been expanding its power long before that. Clinton did it, Biden did it. Trump's just, making it great again, I guess. But if you don't see that the state of the United States is a result of the problems of democracy, not an absence of democracy functioning. It is democracy. If you don't see that, then you can't think structurally yet. It's a direct result of how the system is organized. In some cases, there are things that are being subverted. But in other cases, it's an exact result of, I could go off on this. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but just one example is conflating and making the category error of representative leadership. That's an oxymoron. A leader, like I said before, a leader by definition meets you where you are and takes you somewhere you wouldn't go on your own, right? So we have to decide, any community, any business, any organization has to decide, is the leader a representative of the people's interests? So are they like a union leader? That's like a very clear, supposed to be, representing the interest. My people, they want more money, they want safer working conditions. This is what we've all talked about. And I am the spokesman for them, right? That's a real representative democracy. But that's not leadership, except, it depends on how you define it. It's only leadership in that the person is, I'm going to be the one to stand up and I represent all of these people. But it's not leadership in that it's leading into the unknown somewhere new. It's not making people uncomfortable, challenging their existing ideas, the way they're structurally organized. Real leadership is about going into the unknown and saying, we're going to try something different. And here's the plan. And here's what we think it's going to happen. Here's what we think is going to happen. Here's why it's of benefit to you. And here's why you should try it. Are you in? We're going to get off coal. And we're going to double down on, environmentally friendly energy, or we're going to, become independent of foreign oil. What about the coal jobs? This happened with Hillary Clinton. I forget, in her last election. She folded. This is in Bill Maher's book, and I'll get back to the text in a sec. But she said, we're going to get off of coal. And then some voters in West Virginia were like, well, then what are we going to do? And then she folded and said, I forget what she said, but she left her position and pandered to them instead of saying, guys, you need to learn how to do something else besides dig rock out of the ground. That's not good for the environment. It's not good for you. It's killing people. It causes lung disease. She didn't stand for that. And that's one of the major problems with the Democratic Party. They just don't have the spine. And that's sometimes what a leader needs to do. But again, now step back. what's the structure? So in a modern democracy, is a leader supposed to represent the people or lead them into some discomfort in all of our best interests? Which is it? It can't be both. It doesn't work. Because if it's both, I mean, and then there's another structure. Well, why are leaders pandering? I guess I am going to talk about this. Okay. Why do leaders have to tell people? Why are they compelled to tell the masses what they want to hear? Because they need their vote. Well, why can't they just tell them like it is and not live in fear of losing their vote? Because intelligence and consciousness is not equally distributed. Okay, not at all. It's a bell curve. That's easy to demonstrate. So if you have a state of affairs where most people are not actually qualified, like, for example, 28% of Americans, I believe is the number, give or take a point, 28% of Americans don't know the three branches of the government. Disqualified. You're disqualified from being able to vote. You are not an informed member of the electorate, in my opinion. And if they can't find the United States on a map and don't know the difference in North America and South America on the map, and don't know the Bill of Rights, there's a certain level of information that a functional democracy requires. If they don't have that, then they're easily manipulated by people who want votes and are looking for a job that has no written qualifications, no supervision, no boss, right? Think about a congressman or a senator or a congresswoman or a senator. There are checks and balances, but they don't have a boss. They get a budget, they get a staff, and they get the job for 4 years. And it sounds like a really cush job. No supervision, no qualifications, no metrics, except for making the voters feel good so you get the job renewed again. Well, what an amazing racket that is. So that's a system, you see? That's a structural system that rewards and funnels people with low qualifications, but high charm, high charisma, high manipulation skills, good speakers who are good looking and are looking for power and control the easiest way they can get it. The system produces that, you see? That's the shape of the maze. So, in other words, that's democracy working as designed. And Aristotle and Plato and I believe Socrates saw this in the problem of democracy. This is written down in Plato's Republic. They saw that if you give the power to vote to the masses, then clever people who want power will manipulate the masses for their own benefit. So just look at that one structural issue, though. Is a leader supposed to represent the people or challenge them in a leadership way? It can't really be both. And if you think it should be both, then okay, how? When do they decide? And do the people know that? Is there an agreement about what they can be challenged on and what they can't be? So anyway, let me come back to the text. I guess that was on my mind to want to talk about. I tried not to. Let me look back here. Where was I? So we were talking about shallow coherence, which is very relevant to politics. That's why I went down that road. So this is not necessarily due to a lack of cognitive capacity. Rather, deeper analysis introduces destabilization that the system is not organized to tolerate. The individual stabilizes at the point where understanding feels sufficient, even if it's incomplete. And that's a category error there. Because if something feels sufficient, that's not actual structural thinking. It's just, and this is what politicians do, right? They give you enough information to make most people feel better about it, to give them a sense of, oh, okay, they got it, but it's not complete, and it's astonishing how I believe Kamala Harris and Trump both in the run up to the last election, or maybe it was just Trump, but my memory says they both said, when people say, a journalist says, well, do you have a plan for healthcare system, or do you have a plan for Social Security or whatever? And they'll say, well, I have concepts of a plan. And it's like, an intelligent person really ought not to be satisfied with that answer. But for many people, they go, oh, okay. They sort of relax. Oh, they've got concepts of a plan. They're thinking about it. And they want that stability. They want that reassurance more than they want a leader, in quotes, who will reassure them more than they want a leader who will structurally solve problems in ways that might say, well, in order to solve this problem, we need to raise taxes. Oh, no, but I don't want to do that. That's uncomfortable. Or this is going to wreck the economy for 6 months. But here's the plan. Here's the 10 economists designed this, and we think there's a small price to pay, and then we come out of it. Those kinds of things. The last time in history I can remember that happening, something like that, was Jimmy Carter's famous speech that was critical of American consumerism. That was around the time of the gas crisis in the late 70s, I believe, 79. And, he acted like a leader and said, we've got to stop consuming quite so much, after, the excesses of the 60s, late 60s and 70s. And he was a one-term president for that. People didn't like it. They didn't want any kind of accountability. So elected officials, because of the system, elected officials can't really bring any kind of real accountability. That's systematized. That's how democracy is. The only accountability that they, let me say it this way. The voters can hold them accountable, but the leaders can't bring any strong accountability to their followers. Otherwise, they lose their job or become a one-term president, which, is a big deal if you're in that realm. So anyway, let me get off of politics and back to this piece. Okay, so finally, there is avoidance as a stabilizing strategy. Here, the system minimizes discomfort as quickly as possible, often by disengaging from the problem entirely. Complexity is deferred, effort is reduced, and destabilizing inputs are not engaged. This represents the lowest cost form of stabilization and, predictably, is therefore widely used, particularly in environments where accountability, which I was just talking about, is diffuse and consequences are delayed. So to review, for those of you taking notes, I don't know, you might be, I was joking, but so the stabilizing orientations are emotional, identity-based, relational or harmony-based, shallow coherence, and then the fifth one is avoidance, by far the most popular. You could argue they're all a form of avoidance, but the distinction makes it. Avoidance is really just like the head in the sand. I don't want to deal with this at all. It's not favoring something else over it. It's just favoring simplicity, reduced effort, less input. It's really low cost. So these patterns make visible a crucial point. Truth is not the default stabilizer. It is one option among several, and often the most destabilizing in the short term. To stabilize around truth requires the capacity to tolerate disorientation, cognitive dissonance, to reorganize identity, to risk relational disruption, and to engage complexity without immediate resolution. It requires ambiguity tolerance. It requires living in the unknown. It requires the ability to bear discomfort. Many individuals, or even choose discomfort in some cases, choosing to stay in it because it's real, because it's true. Many individuals are not organized to sustain that level of destabilization. As a result, they select alternative stabilizers that allow for faster recovery of equilibrium. This framework resolves a range of otherwise puzzling observations. It explains why individuals can encounter structurally clear information and fail to reorganize around it. The issue is not necessarily comprehension. It is that the information conflicts with the system's primary stabilizer. A person may understand a critique at a cognitive level while continuing to behave in accordance with emotional, relational, or identity-based priorities. It just reminds me of, I was working with a business client once, social services company, and so they had a lot of lower end sophisticated people, a lot of barely skilled labor, and so they had a lot of labor challenges. Excuse me. And we were talking about accountability, and I was talking to the CEO and owner, and I said, well, what happens when people are held accountable? What's your system? It was like an 800 person organization, so they had some systems. And he said, oh, we have a system for that. When someone has a performance issue, they get a verbal warning, then after that they get a written warning, and then they go to a retraining. And it's like, okay, and what happens if the problem happens after that? Then they get another retraining. And I was like, okay, and what happens in the retraining? Well, they're trained on how they're supposed to run the system, And I said, but they get that training in the first place, right? And he said, yeah. And then when they fail to perform the system correctly or the behavior correctly, then they get retraining again. Yeah. Okay, so if they still don't do it, why do you just keep telling them the same thing? Because you see, the implicit assumption is, well, they're not doing what they're supposed to, so they must not know what they're supposed to do. You see the cognitive leap there? That's not why they're not doing it. And can you imagine being in a job like that? Wow. There's no curiosity, there's no engagement. If someone is told the cognitive, structural, here's how it works, and they know that, and then they do something else, they're doing it for one of these patterns because it's challenging for them in some way. It challenges their point of view or their comfort zone or their identity or whatever. So they're reverting to what they know, not because it's the only thing they know, but because they're otherwise destabilized. And so this is where in my business work, I make the distinction between supervision and management. Supervision is telling the person, okay, you did this, and that's not how we do things. How we do things is this. Here's the system, go retrain, go out there, try again. Good talk. That's supervision. Management is actually getting curious and helping the person evolve, at least minimally, to see why they made the choices that they made. And then you're helping them with their destabilization, at least being a container for it. Okay, back to the text, or else I'll never get through it. Okay, this framework resolves a range of otherwise... Oh, I read that part already. The issue is not necessarily comprehension. It is that the information conflicts with the system's primary stabilizer, whatever that is. A person may understand a critique at a cognitive level while continuing to behave in accordance with emotional, relational, or identity-based priorities. It also explains the persistence of inefficient systems. When a more accurate or effective approach is available, it may still be rejected if adopting it would disrupt existing stabilizing structures. Institutional inertia, in this sense, is not merely a function of ignorance, but of competing priorities. It's largely a function of competing priorities, usually. The system is maintaining stability in one domain at the expense of efficiency in another. All of this is to say, the issue is usually that people don't understand or can't comprehend or don't know. The issue is something else. From the perspective of structural thinking, the implication is direct. The task is not to refine arguments indefinitely in the hope that clarity alone will produce change. The task is to identify what function is actually governing behavior. This requires distinguishing between stated values and operative stabilizers. A person may claim to value truth, or sense even, yet consistently select emotional comfort, or harmonious relationship, or whatever. Another may articulate a commitment to growth, yet avoid any information that threatens identity. And all you got to do is Google the backfire effect on that one. That's widely documented, quantified. Structural thinking proceeds by observing which pattern is enacted, not which is professed. That's the difference between expression and form in this case. Once the operative stabilizer is identified, behavior becomes more predictable. If truth conflicts with the primary stabilizer, the stabilizer will prevail. This is not an anomaly, but a reliable outcome, a system. The question then shifts from how do I make this clearer, like retraining, to what would have to change for truth to become a viable stabilizer in this system? That's a different question. In some cases, this may involve increasing the cost of avoidance, i.e. accountability, or creating conditions in which identity can be reorganized without collapse. In other cases, it may involve recognizing that the system, whatever it is just not available for that shift. You may just have to make peace with what is. That's what I've done with my ongoing neighbor drama and raising money for the road. I'm like, well, if I just explain all of the benefits for creating a structure, having an HOA type thing, and, having an organization, then surely they'll understand and want to do that. No, they don't value that. They don't value organization enough to be able to hear that. I actually had a conversation with one of the neighbors recently, and it was really woke me up to that because I was professing again, hey, wouldn't it be great if this is how we did it and we were organized? And he started talking about, no, that's how HOAs are, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, we wouldn't have to run it like a typical HOA. And it's like, well, that's like legalese stuff. He had all this, like, there can be no such thing as an organization without a bureaucracy. He was conflating the two. And there's no amount of assuring him that it would be different that could get through, at least in that moment, because it was very clearly like a deeply held anti-establishment value for him. Even though, and the way it came up was, I'll make this brief, the way it came up was he said there was a redesign of some drainage related to his driveway, and he said that another neighbor had promised to maintain a ditch if we went with that change. And I said, well, I didn't hear anything about that. Did you have anything in writing? And he's like, I don't think I should have to get something like that in writing. And it's like, well, apparently you did, because I would love to help here, because you think one thing and the other neighbor says that didn't happen. No one can help you because you didn't get that in writing. He's like, I don't think I should have to, have a contract. And I said, there's a straw man, right? I said, I didn't say anything about a contract. You could have just said, hey, can you just sum up our last conversation in 3 sentences in a text? That would have been something. And then I said, if we had an organization, then when agreements were made like this, it would be done in a meeting. There would be minutes documented. It wouldn't have to be any big thing. And he's like, well, I don't want to do that. And like, there it is. So it's like, well, from his perspective, if what he says is true, that neighbor did promise that labor, well, then he got screwed. But still, even though he feels he was screwed, I don't know what's true, he still can't make a leap to, maybe it would be good to have some kind of formal organization, even though that's very uncomfortable for me and I have all sorts of preconceived notions about it. I guess the pain was not great enough. Maybe if he gets screwed harder down the road, it will, because that's what eventually happens. If you're not open to what truths life is trying to bring to you, then it typically will cause more and more pain until you get it. That's just how it goes. So it seems. Okay, let's finish this thing up. This reframing has practical consequences for leadership. Leadership in this context is not defined by the ability to persuade others of what is true. It is defined by the capacity to accurately read the structure within which others are operating and to act accordingly. This may involve working within existing stabilizers, introducing new constraints, or disengaging from systems that are not organized for change. Crucially, it involves relinquishing the assumption that clarity alone is sufficient. And that's where, what I was talking about before, where the representative democracy or representative leadership and structural leadership, there's this zone in the middle where you meet people where they are and respect, which literally means to look twice. You respect their stabilizing systems and work with them to help them accept some amount of destabilization for everyone's own good. If you don't respect how they stabilize, well, then, you might be a dictator or a bully or, whatever. On the other hand, if you only meet them where they are and don't lead them into some amount of discomfort and change, well, then you're just pandering. Then you're not leading at all. You're just creating, harmony. So the same principle applies to the reception of new work. When a structurally coherent framework is introduced, uneven or delayed uptake does not necessarily indicate a problem with the work itself. This is another kind of leadership. It indicates that those encountering it are stabilizing around other priorities. They may be in the process of reevaluation, using the new framework as one input among many, or they may not yet have sufficient friction to reorganize. In some cases, they may not be organized to engage at that level at all. And there's no judgment here. It's just talking about how the structure of it works. But it's important to understand that clarity does not bypass process. Recognition, when it occurs, often does so in hindsight once the individual's stabilizing structure has shifted sufficiently to accommodate the new information. The practical application of this model is straightforward. When confronted with behavior that appears incoherent from a truth-oriented perspective, the appropriate question is not why the individual is failing to recognize what is obvious. The appropriate question is what they are stabilizing around. From there, one can assess what forms of engagement are viable and where effort is likely to be effective. You could call that strategic leadership. Relational leadership, I don't like that so much, but it's certainly more relational. It's structural leadership for sure, because it's respecting the structure of people and how change actually works. In this way, structured thinking moves from abstraction to application. It provides a means of interpreting behavior that is both more precise and more predictive, while reducing the tendency to personalize or overextend in response to others' choices. It aligns action with the actual organization of the system rather than with an idealized expectation of how the system should operate. I'll leave you with a true story, apocryphal anyway, an apocryphal story about systems thinking. This came out of, I don't remember if it was Meg Wheatley or Peter Senge, but when I was studying holistic thinking in the business context, because this kind of stuff is often used. This is, in the business world, this is sort of high-end management consulting stuff. I typically apply it to smaller businesses, but in big businesses, it's a huge deal. I had a guy I did Aikido with years and years ago who was on the team that I believe it was 2000, I don't remember, early 2000s. He was on the team to help Kaiser Permanente. I think they've got like 30 or 40,000 employees switch their medical records from paper to electronic. They were the first big company to do it. And the first time Kaiser had tried to do it, they spent $1 billion with B as in boy dollars, and it failed. Because you've got doctors, nurses, admin, all sorts of people who need to buy in to switch from something as simple as written records to digitized records. But you've got 30,000 people plus that you have to convince to change this habit, because it's on average going to save, each person like 27 minutes a day, and that turns into like $10 billion over time. But they'd spent $1 billion and it had failed. And he was on the team of consultants making a strategy out of like, okay, we're going to try again. How do we do this? Think about the amount of stabilizers operating in so many different people, different cohorts, right? Doctors are operating one way, nurses another way, admin a different way. There's another group, I can't think of what it was because I remember him telling me about it. But it was doctors and nurses, I believe, were in one category, and then there was admin. I thought the insurers was the third group because Kaiser is an insurance company. Yeah. So it was the insurance side, it was the doctors and nurses, the providers, and then the administrators. And they all have different preferences and different stabilizing mechanisms and different agenda, different, they're different stakeholders. And it took years, but they finally did it. I'm not extolling the virtues of Kaiser. I hate that company, but it was an interesting story. But the story I was thinking about was a different one. The apocryphal story is about systems thinking, is about a college campus, and like they had redone all the landscaping and new grass and bushes and trees and whatnot. And the whoever was in charge of the grounds was having this frustration. They did all the re-landscaping, happened over the summer, all nice and new, sod and all that. And then school starts in the fall, and the issue is the students are not following the concrete paths that they had made to go from building to building. They're going off the path and cutting through the lawn. So it's destroying the grass, and people are cutting through bushes and whatnot. And, they're kids and they're complaining. They put up signs and they put up string and they put up more signs. And there's emails that go out maybe, and all that. And finally, this is the apocryphal part of the story. They bring in some consultant, like, what do we do about this? And the consultant says, tear out all of the bushes and all of the thing and jackhammer out all of the concrete, remove it all. And everybody's like, what? That's crazy. This was all really expensive. And he's like, no, remove it all. So they remove it all. And then they wait a week, 10 days. And then they see where are the paths where the students are already going. And then they put concrete where they're already walking. That is the idea. That's meeting people where they are. That's orienting toward where they already stabilize. Now, if you're thinking, isn't that how the Boston roads ended up the way they are? In some ways, yes. Now, that's actually a good example because I'm from around Boston. Oh my God, the Boston roads are insane. They're famously built on old cow paths and horse trails that go back, to the late 17th century. So there is a risk of, if you meet people where they are, it's like, well, this path has worked for 100 years. Let's pave it. Let's turn it into a road. Right, but it doesn't scale necessarily. And that's why Boston is in the state that it is. So those pathways worked well, but it doesn't mean you can add 100 times the traffic and it still works. So that's where the real art of leadership is. How much can you meet people where they are, and in what ways? And in what other ways do you just have to bring accountability and say, yeah, this has just got to be different. The current system isn't working. I'm here to help you transition. I'll hold a container space for you in a way. I can listen to you talk about how difficult it is for you. I'm here to help you, but this is what we're doing. And so you have a decision before you. And that's what a good manager does. You can respect people's destabilization without enabling it. That's what a structural leader does. They say, I get this is hard for you, and I'm here for you, and I'm willing to hear a lot if you want to talk about what it's like for you, but this is the truth that we're moving forward with. And that's not a choice you have, depending on the situation. If it's a job, you can quit. If it's a relationship, you can break up. I mean, we almost always have choices. But life tends to bring us truths that bring the greatest accountability. That's my experience anyway. There is no fiercer manager than life itself. There's no talking back to it. There's no negotiation. When it decides that something's got to change, it's get on the bus or be run over by it sometimes. And it's in all of our self-interest to get on that bus as best we can. But interestingly, we, of course, always have free will, right? So even if it's not the highest expression of truth, we have the free will to not go with that. But what we interestingly don't have the free will to apply is avoiding the consequences. You can do whatever you want, but you can never avoid the consequences. So my final message is understand your values. I have a strong orientation toward truth that I didn't necessarily, not just necessarily, I was made this way. It's structurally there. I've honed it. I've worked on it. Is it perfect? No, surely not. I still sometimes choose comfort over truth. Not as often as I used to. But what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that choosing truth is better than choosing relationality or emotion or shallow coherence. It's not a value judgment. You can do whatever you want. You can stack rank whatever values you want. I'm just saying, I urge you to know what your real values are, and you can find very often what those are by looking at what your chart says about that, because that's structural and will be a mirror for you and show you things maybe that you don't even know about yourself. And then maybe the consequences that you sometimes endure will make a lot more sense. But again, you can value whatever you want. You can stack rank truth however you want in that deck. It's up to you. But no one gets to escape the consequences of that. And that's for your consideration. Bye for now.